Well, hello, and welcome to another episode. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about what is comparatively a very new camera compared to the other cameras that I've been talking about in this channel. And that camera is this camera right here. This is a camera from 1982. So even though it's 40 years old, it is essentially a modern camera by comparison to the other cameras I've talked about. And the reason I want to talk about this camera is this is one of my favorite cameras to shoot with from the 1980s. And it's a very high quality camera, although it is also currently a very inexpensive camera. So for me, this is probably what I would consider to be the best ultra low cost 35mm SLR out there. I really enjoy shooting with this camera. I actually enjoy shooting with this camera much more than I enjoy shooting with other contemporary cameras of this era that are much better known these days and much more expensive. So for comparison, I bought this camera for the whopping price of $10 with lens, and this camera is essentially just like new. So that is less than I paid for the film that's actually in the camera right now. Now, I'm not going to reveal what the brand of the camera is quite yet or who made it. I don't want you to get any preconceived ideas about the quality of this camera until I've had a chance to tell you about the features of the camera and give you some idea of the results that you can expect to get from a camera like this. Like I said, I love using this camera. It's an excellent camera, high quality. It just happens to be incredibly inexpensive. So let's go through the features of this camera, and then you can be the judge about whether you think this might be a good camera for the price. Okay, so I'm going to go over the features of the camera and go through a lot of the functions and controls. I don't typically go over every single control on a camera, but for this particular camera, since I am interested in talking about all of the qualities that make this camera such a joy to shoot with, that I do feel like I do want to at least go through most of the, if not all of the controls. So I'm going to start here on top of the camera, and if you've shot with any camera from the 1980s, 1970s, even late 1960s, this layout is going to look quite familiar. So starting over on the left-hand side, of course, we have the film rewind knob, and surrounding the film rewind knob is the film speed setting dial. And also incorporated within the same dial as the film speed setting dial is the exposure adjustment dial, with adjustment ranging from +2 to -2 exposure value. Now the film speed range ranges from ASA 12 up to ASA 3200. That's fairly typical for the 1980s. By that time there were very few films that were below ASA 50. There were a couple still. But definitely by that era, there were much more high-speed films available. Now, right next to the film speed dial is the self-timer actuator button. This is a little bit of an unusual position for this to be in. You press this button, it's marked self, and that engages the self-timer. On top of the prism, of course, we have the hot shoe with the X-Sync flash here, and I'll get to, there's also a PC socket, but I'll get to that a little bit later. And then on the right side, in the normal position, we have the film wind lever and the shutter release. And then surrounding the shutter release button is the shutter speed dial. And you can see this is one of the things that makes this camera so advanced for its era. Top speed's relatively modest, 1/1000th of a second. That was fairly standard at the time. But check out this range. It goes from 1/1000th of a second all the way down to and past 1 second. That part's not unusual, but then you get to 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 16 seconds right on the dial. So this is the only camera I know of that has 16 seconds as a selectable film speed right on a shutter speed dial. And then of course B for bulb mode. A is for automatic, so this camera can do aperture priority auto exposure. So when you set the shutter speed dial to A, you select the aperture on the lens, and then the camera will select the shutter speed for you. And then the L is the lock, that's essentially off, turning the camera off. Now let's move around to the front of the camera. I have covered up the model name just because I don't want to give it away quite yet. So this has the standard f1.7 50mm lens, an excellent multi-coated lens made in Japan. And the controls on the front of the camera, starting from the left over here, this red light right here is the self-timer flashing LED that tells you the self-timer is operating. Right below it is the exposure engagement button. When you're first getting ready to take a picture, you press this button to check your exposure. And then this lever here is the depth of field preview lever that essentially engages the aperture that you have selected so that you can check the depth of field. And then here on the side of the lens is the lens release for changing lenses. Now over here on the other side of the lens we have the exposure lock button, which for 1982 of a camera of this type, this was a fairly advanced feature to be able to lock your exposure and then move the camera around, point it in different directions and retain that same exposure. And then below it is the PC socket for external wired flash. If you have like a studio strobe set up, you can connect it there instead of connecting it to the hot shoe. Now on the back of the camera, one of the more unique control systems on this camera is it does have built-in multiple exposure controls. Basically you can set the multiple exposure on and then it will remain on as long as you leave it on. So you can do multiple exposures on a single frame much more easily than on other contemporary cameras of the time. So for a fairly modest camera of the early 1980s, this is pretty feature-packed in terms of what it can do in comparison to other cameras that were offered at the time. The multiple exposure controls, very unusual. The auto exposure lock, that's not exactly unusual, but it was fairly uncommon. And then just the wide range of shutter speeds all the way down to 16 seconds. These are all features that are very useful for an advanced photographer. Now the lens itself has all of the typical markings. So you have the focus scale in both feet and meters. Then you have the approximate depth of field markings. This particular lens has f1.7 through f16. Now one of the interesting features on this camera is it does have it's probably really difficult to see here. Let's see if I can get this in the right position. It does have a little Judas window right here which permits a view of the aperture that you have selected. So in the viewfinder you see both the aperture you have selected and then it also tells you the shutter speed. So the ability to see both the shutter speed and the aperture was actually uncommon in the early 80s, if you can believe it. And that is quite a nice feature, again, for advanced photographers to have that information available in the viewfinder. The bottom of the camera, pretty typical. There's the battery cover and then a self-winder connection port here, if you have that, and of course the tripod socket. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the shutter that is included in this camera. So if I open the back of the camera, one of the first things you'll notice here are the metal shutter curtains, which was a pretty advanced feature in the early 1980s. There weren't many cameras offered with metal shutter curtains at that time. So this camera uses the Copal square shutter, which is a very high quality shutter made in Japan, used on a few cameras in the 1970s and 1980s. So all in all, this camera has a lot to offer for the advanced photographer in a fairly unassuming package. And this particular model, even more so than the sister model that it is based on. So again, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the wide range of features on this camera before I reveal the brand name on the camera, just because I didn't want you to get preconceived ideas of the quality of the camera based on whose name is on the camera. So I guess without any further ado, I will reveal what brand name is on this camera. Don't be surprised, but there you can see it. It is actually a Sears branded camera. This camera was sold by the American department store Sears. in the early to mid 1980s. Now obviously Sears did not make the camera. The camera was made by Ricoh, and it is essentially a rebadged version of the Ricoh XR7, which in 1982 was Ricoh's top-of-the-line camera. So this camera, even though it was sold by Sears, is effectively a Ricoh XR7, even though it has different markings on it. So it includes the excellent Ricoh-made lenses. This lens was made by Ricoh, as was a wide range of lenses that were available for the camera. It also uses the K-mount for the lens mount, so it can accept a huge range of lenses made by a whole variety of different manufacturers. It's really a very versatile camera and a very fun camera to shoot with. So I know this is a little bit of a departure from my usual more vintage camera selection, but I did want to talk a little bit about other cameras that beginners can start buying and get involved in film photography without having to spend hundreds of dollars. And I'm not trying to sell you on this particular camera, I'm just trying to point out that there are other cameras available from that era besides cameras from the so-called Big Five. So this camera, being made by Ricoh, is a really high quality camera and can produce some very sharp, high quality results, as you can see from some of these sample images. One reason why I focused on this camera in particular is because of the Sears branding. This camera tends to get overlooked and therefore is often sold at a very low price. But there are plenty of other cameras from that era made by Ricoh and Fujica, Konica, Canon, and other smaller manufacturers that are just as good and in some cases even better than the better known cameras that sell for much more today. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope I have inspired some of you to look for cameras at a lower cost that can perform just as well as the more expensive cameras. And I will see you in the next video.